Achtung, it's James Holland here, minus Al, but I have got a new friend beside me. Well, he's not a new friend, he's a really old friend, actually, Professor Saul David. And Saul, this is a little bonus extra because you have got a new podcast out, haven't you, with the Goalhanger staple, Battleground. Tell me all about it.
I have, and I've got you to blame, frankly. Yes, I'm joining the stable. We're stretching your remit a little bit, actually. We're hoping to cover much of the 20th century and possibly even a little bit further afield, actually. But because we're 40 years on from the Falklands War, I mean, as we speak, we thought we'd start off with a multi-part special on that war. And the great thing is, when I say we, my co-host Patrick Bishop was actually reporting from the war. So you've got me as the theorist.
Wow, I hadn't appreciated he was actually out there at the time.
He was a cub reporter, as he puts it, with the Observer newspaper, and he
That's amazing.
And he also mentioned to me that, but for the fact that none of the more senior reporters actually thought it would lead to a shooting war, he would have been turfed out, and someone far more important would have gone. But they didn't think it would come to that. He was on the task force, and of course, he just kept going and had a wonderful opportunity, career-wise, frankly, to get a big war under his belt.
So how are you playing this? I mean, you obviously Patrick's been out there, so that's a good start. But I mean, what's the USP?
Well, the USP is to do two things. We want a lot of first-hand accounts. So Patrick can tell the war correspondent bit. I mean, he went down in Canberra, but there are lots and lots of other stories that have only been half told, to be truthful, Jamie. And the lovely thing is, 40 years on, as you and I both know, researching the Second World War, people are getting to the end of their sell-by dates now, but they're very much in their 60s and 70s for the Falklands War.
Yeah.
So lots of people to talk to, some great stories. We've already got a wonderful cast list under our belt. People like Lord Luce, the Foreign Office Minister in charge of the Falklands at the time, has given us the political angle. Then, of course, we've got the military, naval. We've got Jeremy Larkin, who was in charge of Fearless. That was the amphibious assault ship. Julian Thompson, the commander of 3 Commando Brigade, who you may know from actually having written quite a number of books. So quite a cerebral.
I did. I went to interview him after some years ago, and he was just talking generically about history, warfare, and God, he was fascinating. I mean, really, really properly interesting.
Yeah, and I think, also another important insight I think we as military historians have for something like this is it takes time for people to actually begin to open up. I mean, yes, they were there, but you can interview them 10 years later, and they're not going to be saying the same things they say 30 or 40 years after that. So I think we're getting some pretty hard-hitting stuff, frankly. I mean, people are not frightened to criticize, and they're not frightened to call out people they think made a bit of a balls up, frankly.
Well, it sounds absolutely fantastic. So hopefully this will be... So Falklands War will be the first bit, and then hopefully you'll go through the whole gamut of 20th century wars and beyond. But I think it sounds absolutely fantastic. What's not to like, frankly?
Well, God willing. I mean, as you know, it always depends on us having the enthusiasm and Goalhanger, wanting us to keep going. But Patrick and I certainly want to, this is a great one to start with, we feel. And if we get enough momentum, yes, we'll definitely keep going.
So I think we should have a little listen from episode 1.
It's the early morning of the 21st of May 1982. Huddled in landing craft, British Marines and paratroopers are about to hit the beach. It's the first step to retaking the Falkland Islands, a scrap of British territory on the far side of the world that had been all but forgotten, before being seized by Argentina 7 weeks before. The first British units land without a shot being fired. Hopes rise that they're going to achieve complete surprise over the Argentinians, but the relief doesn't last long. At 9:25, just after dawn, 9 Argentinian Air Force Dagger jets scream over the rough bowl of hills surrounding San Carlos water, which is crammed with British ships. For the rest of the day, showing great skill and bravery, the Argentine pilots launch wave after wave of attacks. It seems impossible that their bombs won't hit the cruise liner turned troop ship Canberra, which, at more than 40,000 tons, towers over the rest of the ships like a great white whale. But miraculously, it survives. Others are not so lucky. As the Antarctic night descends, the harbour is choked with smoke from burning British ships. 6 warships have been hit, and one, the frigate HMS Ardent, sent to the bottom. But all the troops are ashore. The Rapier missile air defence batteries are being set up, and the British Expeditionary Force is ready to start the most daunting challenge the military has faced since the Second World War.
Exciting stuff. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Battleground Podcast with me, Saul David.
And me, Patrick Bishop.
Every week we're going to be discussing the wars of the 20th century, goodness knows there have been enough of them, and occasionally roaming further afield if we feel the urge.
But given that the 2nd of April 2022 marked the 40th anniversary of the Argentinian invasion of the Falkland Islands, we thought we'd kick off with a multi-part series on that war, following events in real time and trying to mark up all the big themes of the event.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the Falklands War. We've had a preamble, of course, at the beginning of this episode. Very dramatic stuff when the troops finally reached the islands. But really, we need to work out why they got there, how they got there, and the road to war. And we're going to come on to that later on in the episode. But in very general terms, it was an extraordinary conflict, having long claimed a right to Las Malvinas, as the Argentinians called the islands. Their military rulers must have assumed that the British Lion was sleeping its eye off the ball with regard to its most distant possession. There were all kinds of problems besetting Margaret Thatcher's government: infighting, economic crisis. In a military sense, one of our only two aircraft carriers was about to be sold off. Only a handful of Marines were guarding the Falklands, and the only naval ship in the area, Endurance, was about to be recalled. So that's what's happening on the British side. Patrick, what's happening in Argentina at this stage?
The Argentinian side was pretty confused as well. All was not going well at home for them. They've been fighting this long, pretty hideous internal conflict with the military government, turning on its own people essentially, and going after anyone who they considered to be a communist or even a leftist. And this dirty war, as it was called, claimed the lives by this stage of tens of thousands of people. They were looking for a distraction, and the long-standing issue of the islands seemed to provide them with an opportunity to get people's minds onto something else. Whatever differences the Argentinians might have had, they all were united in believing genuinely that the islands belonged to them. So it must have seemed like a terrific opportunity to this embattled junta. Here is this issue that's going to unite everyone. And Britain is really not in a position to oppose us should we go for the dramatic option and launch an invasion. How on earth are they going to come all the way 8,000 miles across the oceans and try and get it back? It seemed like a win-win for them.
Now, Patrick, you and I have written about war. I've gone all the way back to the 17th century. You've written mostly about the 20th century, but it helps a little in this particular conflict, I think, that we can both remember it. I was a 16-year-old schoolboy just about to do my O-levels, but rather unusually gripped by the events in a way that I don't think all my mates at school were. As they were unfolding 8,000 miles away in the South Atlantic, I was watching the TV news as casualties in ships and people began to mount, and feeling an odd sense of detachment as if it wasn't real. But you, of course, Patrick, for you it was far too real. What were you up to then?
Well, in those days I was a youngish reporter working for the Observer newspaper, and like everyone else, I was taken by surprise by events. My beat was Northern Ireland in those days, so I knew a little bit about the military. But all of a sudden, this crisis blows up, and if you're a journalist, a young ambitious journalist, it's a huge opportunity. So I grabbed it and managed to persuade the paper to nominate me as their correspondent with the task force. I think at that point no one really thought that it would end up in a real shooting war. If they had, they might not have sent me and sent someone more senior.
One of the striking things for me, and everyone in the country for that matter, was how suddenly it blew up. It seemed to come out of nowhere. We were literally looking on maps, on atlases, where actually where are the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic? And when you do identify them on the map, it's quite shocking how close they are to Argentina. We're talking just about maybe 300 or 400 miles, but 8,000 from here. The response was cobbled together, it seemed to me, in a very short space of time. It was very ad hoc and very British, really. I mean, could we get enough force together to do something about this?
That's right. One of the senior officers involved in it told me once that it was a lash-up. The whole thing was a lash-up, a naval expression, which means you just grab whatever is at hand and try and forge it into some sort of workable instrument. And that's exactly what happened. They were just reaching where they could for what resources were available. It was a very British lash-up at that, and in the end it did work. But it certainly didn't look very likely that it was going to succeed at the beginning, largely because of this national mood, which was very intense. I think anyone listening now would be surprised at just how deep the malaise was in Britain at that time. You got very high unemployment. For me, the kind of theme tunes of the time were Oliver's Army, the great Elvis Costello number, and the Specials' Ghost Town. So there's this kind of feeling of terminal decline. You've got this new female prime minister who, in those days, she wasn't the Mrs. Thatcher we came to know. She was, she was unpopular. That bit remained true, but she was very much an untried quantity. And she herself, was the first to admit at the time that she didn't really know much about the business of governing. So there's this sense of drift and of hopelessness. And although the armed forces nowadays have a very high place in the national estimation, in those days they didn't. And indeed, the Falklands War was something that actually restored their credibility and their honour in some ways. They were either invisible, like the Royal Navy. You never heard anything of the Royal Navy at all. Or when they did pop up in the news, it was usually in a slightly negative way. They were in Northern Ireland trying to keep the peace, and invariably, from time to time, there'd be some sort of shooting incident or something, and this would create a sort of media flurry about the army's tactics and behaviour. So all in all, Britain didn't seem to be in a very good place. Is that how you saw it, Saul? I mean, you're a young guy, but you studied the period.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think of it from a military history perspective, it's downhill all the way since the end of the Second World War. Our armed forces are gradually diminishing in effectiveness, size. The Navy is getting smaller, and it's about to get a lot smaller too. And there was very much a feeling, I think, even growing up, that, we were no longer a great power. We were heading very much for second-class status. We were, of course, still members of NATO, but we felt we needed to latch on to other powers like the US, like other...
Well, that was a little sample of episode 1 from Battleground, the Falklands War. And of course, you can get this anywhere that you get We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Do have a listen, people. It's going to be fantastic.